Hello, lovely ladies and listeners. Welcome back to Wamen. It's been a few weeks. We've all been very busy, but we've got a full panel, which is fantastic. Welcome back, Turtle. Lovely to see you as always.
Lovely to see you as well. It's always a pleasure to be here.
And we've got two new panelists. So we'll start with Dawn. Welcome to the show for a start. Do you want to introduce yourself to those who are listening?
How long have you got? Oh no, just Dawn Browning in Australia. And yes, it's my first time on here, and very happy to be invited.
Fabulous. I'm very happy to have you. And Buttercup, welcome.
Thank you. I'm Buttercup. I'm from South Africa, and I'm very happy to be here. I've been listening to Women's Hour for a long time, and yeah, I know a lot about the subject, so I'm happy to be here.
Fabulous.
Oh, good, because I don't know much about books, but go on.
I'm glad we have such a range panel as well. It's always nice. We've got four completely different places, which is fabulous. So yes, tonight's topic is books, which I know is a little bit broad, but books in general. I mean, I love books. I have many. I was going to count them, and I never got around to it. I might put that on my Twitter later. I'll go around and count all my books. It might take me a while. But for a quick off start, before we jump into our panelists, I did a little bit of research on the origin of books, because obviously we've always had books. They've always been there. And the main thing I found was that the earliest known written documents that most similarly, I can't speak tonight, I'm so sorry, align with modern books are known as codexes. The codex was developed by the Romans to replace scrolls and is formed by binding a stack of handwritten sheets on one side. Now, I immediately assumed that we got books from scrolls. We jumped straight from scrolls to books. But no, we had the codex in between. So there's a little bit of knowledge for you, if you didn't already know. So I'll open it up to the board. Books. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Are you a reader? Are you not?
I hate books. I'm not a reader. Yeah, I am not a reader. Not at all. I can go into that later, but I have read books. 2 years ago, I read 7 books in 1 year due to my husband trying to guide me into reading. Found it a very unpleasant experience for the most part, but I can go into detail about that later. I'll let everyone else answer their question.
I think I've read too
Go
many.
for it, Buttercup.
And some of them I've read over and over again. And it's really terrible. I have comfort books, and I have a disgusting amount of books that are with my dad at the moment, and I have my own little bookshelf. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, I used to read a lot. My reading these days consists of gardening, husbandry, cooking, and but I have read books. I've actually just ordered a book yesterday. I've ordered Edward Dutton's book about Jonathan Bowden. So there. I will be reading that one because I'm very interested in him.
Fantastic. I like that, again, we've got a completely wide range of opinions. Some people do like books, some people hate them. Leading from Dawn's comment, actually, it kind of leads me on to genres. Now, I struggled with reading, a bit like yourself, Turtle. I struggled with reading for years, and not because I couldn't read. It was because I couldn't get into a book. I found it boring until probably last year, when I picked up a book series, and I now cannot stop, which I absolutely love. I love the fact that I've got back into reading, because I do love books. I have so many on my bookshelf, and I used to love reading, and then it became boring, which I think is the struggle with some books, is they can become boring. And there's a big difference between my books and my husband's books. Now, my husband says that he uses, it's not really a library, it's the dining room with many bookshelves, that he uses it as a reference library, whereas my books are all sort of fantasy and historical fiction, and stories, and they are the complete opposite from from his books of reference, should we say. His are definitely more fact-based. But looking at the genres, there's no agreed upon number on how many genres there actually are of books. There's documents listing that there are about 50 genre divisions, which blows my mind. 50 is absolutely ridiculous. The top 10 genres, which do make a lot more sense, are romance, fantasy, science fiction, paranormal, mystery, horror, action adventure, historical fiction, contemporary fiction, and thriller or suspense books. And I didn't even think that there were even a top 10, which I know sounds crazy, but I feel like everybody does sway towards a certain genre. As I just said, I've got fiction and stories, but on the other hand, again, from Dawn and Buttercup, I have books that are garden based. I've got a lot of gardening books, which are my version of my reference library. I've got books on sewing, I have tailoring books. So that kind of genre in itself, it's hard to get away from the textbook style, especially if you don't like books. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's one of those things you either do like reading or you don't, or it's something that you may need to do a bit more investigating in on and trying different genres, etc.?
I really see them as reference, or even a necessary evil, like going to the dentist. It has its purpose, but no, I just. Sorry, I just can't get into it. I can read. And when I do pick up a book and it is mildly interesting, when I actually have picked it up, opened it, and started reading, I start to get my interest up. And that'll keep me on the book for a while. But every time I do it, it just feels like such a chore. I don't know if I answered your question. I just went onto a tangent, but yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah, I was going to say.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Being too polite.
The sewing encyclopedia that unfortunately got damaged. But I think the only time I looked at the encyclopedia was when it got damaged and I needed to repair it or save the pages. So I hardly looked in it, but it would have been, it was very sad. I did save a few pages, and yeah, I just hardly look at the hobby books as much as I read novels, I think. But they're really nice.
Yeah,
I have a few gardening books as well, and it does get very interesting. Some of them can go into some, lore behind the plants and history or something like that.
I like books I could use, like a cookbook or turtle husbandry or something like that. But no, it's mostly for reference. They can be very useful that way. But other than that, it's just so hard to get me to read.
Yeah, I'd say my favourite book is called Spotless, and it's the ultimate guide to stain removal. And it's an A to Z of how to remove stains from different fabrics, and all upholstery, pavers. It's just an amazing little book. Saucepans, it's great. Another book that I love is The Deep State Encyclopedia by Really Graceful. I invested in that one, and yeah, so I like to have a look through that. But my reading history would be, going back to my younger days, would be Stephen King, Dean Koontz, all the horror stories. I was never into romantic novels, and sci-fi. I love my sci-fi, and so now I'm turning more into reference and information. Another one of my all-time favourite books is Aesop's Fables. How can you not like that book?
Absolutely. I do find it interesting how I feel like as we get older, we tend to go towards the more reference style books and books that have more information on them. But it is so easy to pick up a phone and just Google it now, but I find it way more interesting, and the information goes in way more if I can actually go to my bookshelf and take that book off and go, actually, that information's right there, and I can see it in front of me. Whereas if you put it in on the internet, you have so many different references from so many different websites, and they'll all be slightly different. And I don't like to give myself that confusion. I think, right, I'm just gonna look on my bookshelf and just stick to that book. I'm not gonna confuse myself with other references. But I do have to admit that I definitely don't use them as much as I should, which is really bad. You know, I like your book, the Spotless book, Dawn. That sounds brilliant. I'm gonna have to look that one up, because that sounds brilliant. But as we're on favorite books, I see there's a couple of comments there as well coming in. So we'll go around the board. Favorite books to begin with, and favorite authors. And again, I think this changes as we get older. So we'll start with childhood books, or books that you have specifically for your children, if you have children. So childhood books, I have to admit I have a few, and Michael Morpurgo definitely stands out for me as childhood books, and Dr. Seuss as the sort of what I call the idiotic brain rot books, because they don't make any sense, and I love that, and they're bright colors and they are crazy. But Michael Morpurgo books, absolutely love them. Some of them are obviously based from where I'm from as well, so I can actually picture it very well, and I still have some of his books now. So childhood books, going around the board. You don't have to be polite.
Is that me first? I'll jump in. Well, mine was Enid Blyton, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm older, so I'm that genre. And another one I remember reading was Sewell's Black Beauty. I can't think of the first name.
Yes.
But yeah, Black Beauty. That was an awesome book. And now I'm a grandma. I bought there was a lovely lady who worked in a theatre, I guess you call it, called Abby Wood, who's no longer with us. And she wrote a book called What Hard Work. I bought that for my grandchildren. And I've also got another book called Go the Fuck to Sleep for my grandchildren. I've just got a whole box of books that I'll sit down and read to them when they're here. And occasionally I'll pick up something out of Aesop's Fables. So I try and, get them interested in things that are a bit different to what's targeted at them. So yeah, there's my childhood books.
It was Anna Sewell. I had a copy of Black Beauty. I just looked at it. So it's Anna Sewell. That
rings a bell. Awesome. Yeah. Have I finished? Was that it? We're just talking about childhood books.
Yep, childhood books. Turtle or Buttercup, okay. Childhood books, childhood authors.
Yeah, I read Black Beauty several times when I was about 11 and 12 years old. I loved it. I loved the movie too. I read a lot of R.L. Stine, like Goosebumps and the Choose Your Own Adventure. And other than that, I would read magazines a lot as well, suited for teens. And there's one book in particular that I loved, and I ate it up when I was 14, and that was a biography of Henry V. And for some reason, it just captivated me, and I gobbled it up in about a month. And so that's a little out of character, I guess, but as a child, that was one of my favorite books. Another thing I always used to do is I'd go to my parents' library, and I'd love to sift through all of their medical books as a child. Just look at the gross I'd look at the gross pictures.
Should we be worried about you?
Yeah, maybe. I'd shock myself at the gross pictures of the disease, or I would learn something interesting of like, oh, that's a cool disease, or that's a very interesting condition, and I learn about anatomy, and I was just kind of fascinated by the facts, and learning, all the different, just it's one area of expertise where you can never learn too much about it. And that's just something that I found very interesting as well, was looking through their textbooks. I would say in general, I liked nonfiction, like the textbooks, the Henry V, reading information that I find I could use or that I could directly apply to the world around me. Getting into fantasy, I found was very difficult.
I feel like as a child as well, you're more prone to wanting to find out facts. You have more of an interest to do that. I remember having the Horrible Histories books. I'm not sure if anybody here knows Horrible Histories at all, but they were very funny books. But they, quite literally as it sounds, it was history, but for the younger generation. So they made it gruesome on purpose, with cartoons and funny quotes, and I did enjoy reading them. And some of the history facts I know now are because of the Horrible History books. So yeah, I do think as a child you're kind of captivated to look at these things. And the Guinness Book of World Records, that was another one that I found myself looking at, because as a child I was, the same as you, Turtle. You want to be interested in the weird and wonderful and the limits of a person and all these crazy things. Buttercup, your childhood books or authors?
There was a lot of them. Roald Dahl. I read the BFG so many times. I love the BFG, the Twitches, all the funny stories. And then in my late teens, I read a lot of Terry Pratchett, Douglas Adams. So there was a lot of British influence, I think, in a lot of the reading that I did.
I like to hear that. The British
Beatrix
influence.
Potter. Oh, I love Beatrix Potter.
Oh yes, absolutely. You can't go
still
wrong.
love her though.
Cannot go wrong with Beatrix Potter at all. Any Beatrix Potter. And my mum has the Beatrix Potter set in her library, and I'm dying to get my hands on it. She has all of the books, and I really want them. I refuse to buy the set.
It's just cute little animals talking in clothing. It's adorable.
Wholesome, inoffensive. You can't go wrong with a bit of Beatrix Potter. On that note, I keep looking down at my notes while I'm doing this, because the books are one of those things. There's so many that you can't focus on just one. So we've gone from childhood. Did anyone here go through a weird teen stage of reading, where it's quite common if an adult, like, I'm going to dob myself in big time now, if an adult like myself is now reading fantasy, adult fantasy, we're not talking, silly little fairies, we're talking adult fantasy here. For anyone who knows, we read the Harry Potter trilogy, we read the Twilight Saga, we read Hunger Games, all those sort of series we read, and now we're reading series with way more in-depth and very in-depth war scenes, and you've got about 20 characters going on, and it's chaos. But that seems to be a theme of, if you read certain books as a teenager, a lot of adults are kind of brought back to them now. I mean, Turtle, are you still reading any first aid or medical books that I should be aware of? Or
well, no, mostly because I don't have them on hand right now for me to explore.
Do we think that's true? Do we think the books we read as teenagers influence our genres that we read now?
I think so.
I wouldn't say so.
Friends... Oh no.
Well, I got into the Catherine Cookson. My mum was heavily into Catherine Cookson, and I read quite a few of them. One of them that sticks in my mind was the Malin Streak, and I think it's because it was based around the region of the UK that I was living in, and yeah, so that was a lot of slightly smutty and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, no, that didn't affect my reading as I got older.
Mm-hmm.
I did read Harry Potter, Rick Riordan, and I think Hunger Games before like the movie came out. And I think it was because my friends were reading it. And it was the very popular books at the time to be reading because they came out at the exact time when, I was the targeted market. So I'm not sure, because now I'm reading sci-fi and it's complicated and a lot of different I've read a lot of different books now than I think I would never have guessed that I would read when I was a teenager. So yeah, I have no idea.
Would you say that you've now expanded your genres? So you went from reading things, like Rick Riordan, and now you kind of you read loads of different genres instead of sticking to just one.
I think so, because straight after that, when I left high school, I started reading Pride and Prejudice, which I think is, a straight line of defense from those kinds of books. And then, now I'm reading stuff like Heaven's Mirror or The Three-Body Problem or like The Power of the Coming Race. So it's all very different. I think I've gotten to a lot more adult books, especially now, then. So it could just be growing up.
I actually, when I read my bout of 7 books, they were mostly children's books. And I really, really enjoyed them when I was reading them. Like Watership Down was one I read, which I absolutely loved. Wind in the Willows I absolutely loved. These were all classics that most children read. I never heard of them when I was younger, but my husband introduced them to me. And another fantasy series as well he had me read. So like, I don't know how to put this. I've always loved fantasy in every form. I never read fantasy that much as a child, but my imagination was bonkers. And I feel as if as I get older, I loved reading the fantasy books because it was escapism, because the nitty-grittiness of real life that I was so curious about when I was a child kind of gets me down as a grown-up. So I like reading the fantasy to sort of take a breath. When I was reading the fantasy, I just take breathing space from the difficulties of adult life. But I never feel like my taste changed. I feel like I'm always interested in the same things, but based on my maturity level, I will gravitate towards one or gravitate towards the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think if you really get into a book, it can be a form of escapism as well, especially with fantasy, because you are disappearing into a completely different world. The Faraway Tree was one I used to read when I was younger, and that was one that a lot of my friends read as well.
That was fantastic.
Yeah, you just disappear into a different world. It was wonderful. Going by the comments, I think we're swiftly moving on to the favorite books, and I know we're only about halfway through, but I feel like everyone on this panel is going to have at least one favorite book, and they're going to have plenty to say about it. So I'm not going to start this time. Buttercup, should we start with you?
Pride and Prejudice.
Pride and Prejudice. Straight in with Pride and Prejudice. What are your favorite books?
It would be dishonest of me to say anything else. I've reread that book a disgusting amount of times, and it's just one of those. On every reading list that you probably will see, Pride and Prejudice is going to be on that, and it's deserved. It's a very good book.
When did you start reading Pride and Prejudice?
I think matric, so grade 12. It was difficult. It was very difficult. When you spend your life reading things in like text, on your phone, it's a very different experience because it was made in the 18th century, Victorian era. So yeah, it almost seems like a different language first time you read it, and then when you read it, you start to pick up on like the small jokes and the little witty remarks and how cute these two are, and it's very adorable.
Yeah, definitely. I have read Pride and Prejudice, but I have to admit I did struggle the first time I read it, and I think it is because it feels like it's in a different language. So maybe I need to give it another go and and see how far I get with it.
It is a difficult book.
Turtle, do you have any favorite books?
I do. It would be Watership Down.
It's so sad, though.
It's sad. Yeah, there's some really gruesome moments in that book.
Yeah.
But
I'm really getting worried about Turtle now.
I'm sorry. But I can explain why it's my favorite book.
Please do.
Yes. Number one, I have a very strange infatuation with England and the countryside. I don't know if it's because I'm part English and I've never been there, and like part of my blood wants to go back. I don't know. So I loved that part. I also love animals and anthropomorphize. Can someone? I can't pronounce it. Putting human qualities to animals. I find that endearing because I love animals, and I often would wonder what they were thinking, what they could say, they would say if they could speak. So it had that aspect. It had adventure in it as well. It had conflict, and also I loved how the rabbits had their own culture, their own history, their own stories, their own songs, and like what would a rabbit sing about if they could sing? It had so many different layers, rather than just being a rabbit making a zillion kids once a year. It was very lovely, and that book definitely had me entranced for sure.
Do you think it was because it was so in depth that it wasn't just this depressing story? It was actually about the individual animals as such, and it had a much deeper meaning.
Yeah, I think that's it. It wasn't sort of like a cheap entertainment. It gave that dimension of their different personalities, their histories, their conflicts. Again, made something that I could relate to as a human being. And Bigwig was my favorite character for sure. Big and stompy, which is kind of how I like things. So, yeah.
Dawn, do you have a favorite book?
I'm going to really go against the grain here. My favourite book at the moment, it could be a different one in a couple of weeks once I get the Jonathan Bowden book. But it's a book by Paul Kingsworth or Kingsnorth, and it's called One No Many Yeses. It's probably about 20 years ago when I read the book, and it really changed my opinion on, it changed my worldview. And, sort of started making me more curious about how society, the world operates. And, so I'd say that is my favourite book.
That's really interesting.
You've never heard of it?
I know.
Yeah,
I've never heard of it. Is it a more political style book?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
It's probably why.
Yeah. And the Atheist Manifesto.
I've heard of that one. I have heard of that one.
Yeah, that's interesting. It challenges your beliefs and gives you opinions from, different religious views, beliefs, etc. Yeah, very interesting. But yeah, no, I'd definitely say One No Many Yeses.
Brilliant. Which one do I choose now, though? That's that you've all been so well behaved and only chosen sort of one or two books, which is I've written down about 5. The one I always go to that I've mentioned on Wamen Hour before is a book by Tanya Cross, and it's called Morwellham's Child. And it's another one I've read it probably as many times as you've read Pride and Prejudice, Buttercup, but it's based in, this is going to be really hard to explain, but it's based in a Victorian port and copper mine. Now, this particular place I worked at from the age of 14 until I was 18. So reading the book, I could picture where everything was, and I could put those characters in place. And I started reading it when I was there, actually, which probably helped as well. I was reading it whilst I was working. But I always get drawn back to it. And every time I read it, there seems to be some little fact or something that I either didn't pick up the first time round or the fourth, fifth time round, or something that I'd completely forgotten, a tiny little detail that's actually so important to the storyline. But since reading that one book, I now have an entire shelf full of Tanya Cross books, because they're all based in and around Devon and Dartmoor, which is where I'm from. So they're very much, I can picture exactly where it is in that town or where it is on Dartmoor, and it makes it all that more sort of enthralling, and I can get more involved and I can picture it. And they're not really, I wouldn't say they're in-depth books. I'd say they're quite easy reads. They're not, I'd say that they're more targeted towards an older teenager than they are an adult. But it's one of those, if you want some easier books to read, or in fact, Turtle, if you want some English books to read, I would definitely recommend Tanya Cross. She's fantastic. Absolutely love her books. Other favorite books, have quite a few now. This is the problem. That's the one that probably started it all off. Should we go on to recommendations? I feel like this is going swiftly into recommendations. So recommendations, I've obviously already recommended Tanya Cross as an author. But some other books and recommendations that I'd definitely say is, some might know these authors' names. They've kind of taken over the internet at the moment. You've got Rebecca Yarros, who, has anyone here heard of her? Rebecca Yarros with the Fourth Wing series, the Empyrean series?
No.
Nope.
I'm so glad you said that, so I don't end up getting caught out by this. I was a bit iffy to begin with, but it is a fantasy book. I have to admit, it's an adult fantasy, so yes, there are some pretty spicy scenes in there. But I was unsure to begin with. I was quite unsure, and people kept recommending it, and it got recommended to me. So I read the first book, and I am addicted to it. I'm on the second book now, and the third book came out at the end of last month. So I now have to finish it, which is driving me insane. But it's another one of those books that since I read Morwellam's Child, I now pay attention to my books. So I do take more time reading them. And I think that's rather kicked me in the foot a little bit, because I'm now starting to figure out certain things, and I've got a horrible feeling I know what happens at the end of the third book, and it's driving me insane. But Rebecca Yarros, definitely worth reading her Empyrean series. The other author
Can I add something? Oh, go on. I was just going to add something to that. When you read a series of books, like you're saying, then you're excited, you think you know what's going to happen and everything like that, and you'll be there reading till 3 o'clock in the morning, burning the midnight hour, and then you wake up in the morning, you sat on the bog reading it, and and then you get to those last few pages, and you're so excited, and then you get to the end, and it's like. It's like you have a sense of grief. It's like, it's over.
Yeah.
Oh, how sad. And
it sucks. And the next recommendation, it completely agrees with that. It was another series I read by Sarah J. Maas. If anyone has heard of her, she's another fantasy writer, and again, it's another one that's full of smut, but they are very good stories. And it was the ACOTAR series, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and there are 5 books in that series, and you're completely right, Dawn. As soon as I finished that series, I was grieving for that series. I was like, no, I need more. You know, I'd finished it, and I was like, no, but there were parts missing, and there is another book due to come out. There were too many questions left unanswered. Let's put it that way. But you get so engrossed, and you follow these characters from the beginning to the end. And it's like the feeling you get when you've you've either read or watched Lord of the Rings, and you follow all the characters from the beginning all the way through to the end, and when it's finished, you kind of have that bit of a grief, and you think, oh well, it's over. What do I do now? I have to go back to reality, which is not ideal. But yes, Sarah J. Maas is another one. I do have a few more of her books actually, which are in my to be read table at the moment, but I haven't jumped onto hers yet. As I said, I'm stuck with the Empyrean series. Who else have we got here? Patrick O'Brian. Has anyone heard of Patrick O'Brian? You will when I tell you the book.
Oh, nope. Rings a bell.
Rings a bell. Master and Commander is the book. Most people know the film.
Of course.
Of course. He's an interesting one. Now I only actually have Master and Commander as the book. Now, of course, those who do have that book specifically, all the others know that it is part of a much larger series. The film itself was actually based over 2 books. So it's actually based on Master and Commander and The Far Side of the World, which is 2 separate books. So I need to get my hands on Far Side of the World. But I would, if you wanted something a little more challenging, I would say not, academically challenging, but something that you have to concentrate on. One that I do have to, I mean, this is personally, I do have to concentrate quite a lot when reading that one, because it's written in such a way that you do have to pay attention to what's going on, because it jumps scenes a little bit, and you have to kind of stick with the characters and figure out where you are at the time, which sounds daft, but you're not always on the ship. Let's put it that way. But I would suggest reading Patrick O'Brian, especially if you have seen Master and Commander, because they are very different. The book and the film are actually quite different. Enough of me yabbering on. I think I've put enough recommendations out there. Does somebody want to jump in with their book recommendations or author recommendations?
I really enjoyed Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I would recommend that to anybody, especially, if people like to have a deep psychological view into other people and how people of different backgrounds and different persuasions interact with each other, and that sort of dance as well. I found that book very compelling. So, I mean, it's a classic. Many people have heard of it, but when I was introduced to Dostoevsky, I was very impressed and very moved by it. So that book in particular, if no one has read that, I recommend it.
He's a good author. Good choice. I like that. He has an interesting history as well. I read because there was a small trend with Dostoevsky on Twitter, I think. And so I read The House of the Dead and the Gambler. And those were pretty interesting books. And I think they were pretty close to the heart for him, because he went to prison during the Soviet era for socialism or something to that degree. And he was there for about 20 years. And this was mostly about his time in jail, which was absolutely brutal. And then afterwards, his addiction to gambling. So there was that. And there's also a country called Stratherick by Alan B. Lawson. And this was a book that I picked up when I went there. And I think it's quite amazing when you go to Britain and there's just like you said, there's just like books on the places at the places. So it's just so immersive, I think. So I went there, and this book has everything about Cairns and the law and order there, and there was churches, these beaten up churches that were there for years and years, hundreds of years. And there's also the stone circles and the little I believe it's like these rings that are in the rocks that are quite interesting and old, and a lot of interesting stuff about Scotland and the Highlands. And now it's a fantastic book, and it's made by a local author as well. And a recent book I finished was The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, which was pretty short, but it was very detailed. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about traditionalism in it. It would be interesting for someone to read. It's not very long, and the words are big. So there is that. But yes, it's an interesting book. Worth a look. There's some stuff about contraception, or that was briefly put on, and it's kind of like an introductory book to kind of how everything went south after the Second World War, pretty much, I think. So yeah, I'd recommend those books to the viewers. But everybody else, I think Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, that was very good. I know that you guys talked about it before on the show, and I love it. It's a very good book. So yeah, those are my books that I recommend.
Fantastic. Dawn?
Oh, I'm going to wing it again. I've recently been given Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, so I'd love to say I recommend that one. I've started reading it, but the book's so old that the pages are falling out as I'm turning them. so I'm going to try and get myself another copy of that. Now, one book I'd recommend is, it's a book that you write yourself, and it's called My Grandmother's Life. It's like a journal, and I know you're probably not all grandmothers yet, but it goes from your childhood, through marriage, and oh gosh, how many pages? It's about 200 pages journal, which is not big enough for me. Could go on all night, but it's things. It gives you suggestions of what to write down. Things. It will give you like a leader. Using all 5 senses, describe the best day you had during high school. And then another one will be who or what impacted you the most during your adolescence. What was the biggest fight you had with a friend that you were able to work through? So you're writing it for your grandchildren, even whether you have them or not, but you can start off writing it now as you're going along, because when you're a grandmother, you don't really have much time to write. So it's taken me bloody ages to fill this book in. But yeah, so that's a book I recommend.
That's really sweet, actually. I've seen similar ones for parents. It's my mum's life or my dad's life, but it's quite nice you can get them for grandparents as well. I think that's a really nice idea, and it's a good gift as well. It's something that you can sort of keep throughout the family and share memories with, which is lovely. We've all gone on mute. Fabulous. Circling back around again, because I'm sat in my dining room / library, which makes my house sound massive. I love saying that. It's not. It's like a little hobbit hole. I'm surrounded by my books, so I'm now sort of looking across, thinking, oh yeah, I could mention that one. Oh yeah, I could mention that one. We've got 15 minutes, so I'm quite happy for all of us to waffle about more books. So I'll start off by saying 2 that maybe 3 authors that I'm currently staring at. Guy Martin. Have we heard of Guy Martin?
Nope.
Nope.
Fabulous. Search him. He's brilliant. He was a superbike racer, but I will say sort of recently retired. It's not actually that recent anymore. But he's a mechanic by trade. He was a lorry mechanic. I think he still is a lorry mechanic, actually. But he kind of made his way onto the TV scene by restoring various things. And I have 3 of his autobiographies, and they are brilliant. He's a very funny bloke, very down to earth, and you might think, oh, they're just about him fixing things and mechanics, but it really isn't. It is about his life and what he's done, which I know sounds daft when I say it's an autobiography, but if you're managing to write 3 autobiographies, I think you've done enough. You've done quite a lot of things. But I mean, I will claim to fame with Guy Martin as he restored. There's two things. He restored a ship that is now must be about 320 odd years old. And it was one of the last sailing clippers, last sailing clippers in Cornwall, and he restored it from basically rack and ruin all the way up. And I didn't know that he'd restored it at the time, but I went sailing with my school, and it was called the Tall Ships Exhibition, and it was one of the tall ships in the group, and I sailed that boat. I was on that boat for 11 days. And we always made a joke saying that the mast always creaked, and we're like, why is the mast creaking so much? Why is it doing that? And it is a wooden boat. It's completely wooden hull, everything. It's not, the only modern thing is the sonar that you have to legally put in now. But we sailed it for 11 days. And when I came across his documentary on Leader, she was called, it turned out that they did replace the mast, but they put a penny, an old penny. Is it a penny or a silver piece? I can't remember now. At the base of the mast, and then put the mast on top of it. So we always joked, saying that it was the penny holding the mast up. It wasn't. That was something for luck that they used to do with the old ships. So that was the first claim to fame. And the second one was one I did actually know about, but I didn't sort of clue on until I put two and two together. Was most people know this about me anyway, but I flew a Spitfire. I was very lucky enough to be able to fly a Spitfire, and it was a 2-seater trainer Spitfire, and Guy Martin flew the same one when he restored his own Spitfire. So they decided to take him up in the Trainer 9, and it turned out to be the same plane. So that's very interesting to see sort of snippets of those things in his books as well, and I can kind of relate to them. So that's very interesting. But jumping very quickly onto the next authors before we do another round of any more book recommendations. Alexander Adams, of course. Artivism's one of them. Culture War and Iconoclasm. I can't even say the word. All 3 of those, very, very good, very interesting. If anybody wants to read those. And of course, Ed Dutton's books. I'm not going to mention some of the titles I have. So I think we can already guess which ones they are.
Making Sense of Race?
Sorry?
Making Sense of Race, Edward Dutton?
No, surprisingly not. No.
Oh, that's really interesting. I've read that one. That is really interesting.
That's one I do need to read, actually. Yeah, that's one I do need to read. I don't have that one.
Well, you're not having my copy.
We'll start swapping books now. So Ed Dutton's books are always very interesting and very in depth as well, and they can be quite amusing as well. So definitely recommend Ed. Right, let's go. We've got 10 odd minutes left. Any more book recommendations, ladies?
Well, there's something I wanted to talk about, which is not about books, but rather the manner and how we read books.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very important. So as I said at the beginning, like, I hate reading. I haven't read a book in a very long time, except for the books that my husband had me read a couple of years ago. I never got into it. Hurts my brain. Books are slippery when you try to clean the bookshelf. It's just like nuisance. So, but I will say that I love being read too. My husband's been reading to me every night. Lord of the Rings.
Oh, yes. And I'm fanatical about Pete Kanona's. Oh, I love his series. Oh, you should look into him, Peter Kanona's. But he's more political, and I won't. Yeah, go on.
Sure. So I love being read to. And I think, like, before the written word even, and before everyone could read, we really got all of our stories by mouth, sitting around the campfire, whatever. People would tell stories. And I just find that auditory aspect of stories much more compelling. And it definitely gets my imagination going more, just to recline and look off into space while someone reads to me from a book, and I can put all the pictures together in my mind. And I just recently learned that in the 19th century, at 18th and 19th century, people would actually get together for one person to read a book, and that was sort of their social engagement. Not everyone could read, that's one thing, but just sitting together, knitting, or having a drink, and just having someone read from a book. You get the literature in, and it's just, you made it into a social thing. I feel like reading right now is very solo. Um, more of a, that's not really a bad thing, but I feel like I wish we could have like get-togethers where a person reads from a very famous book, and you meet like once or twice a week, and you just kind of get together and listen to the book, and have snacks or something. I just feel like that's the best way for me to get a story really ingrained into my mind, is to have it read to me, and it makes it more of a social experience. And I don't know, I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is
I
a very
think this used to
solitary.
happen quite a lot when I was, well, I say when I was younger. I remember my dad used to read to us all the time. But I feel like, sadly, that's kind of been overtaken by audiobooks. So you're absolutely right in saying reading has become a very singular thing. It's become very isolated. We don't tend to share books as much as we used to anymore. And I love sharing books with people. I've told lots of people to say, if you need a book on something, then come to us. We most likely have it. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of putting something. Although I do have to admit, if I'm not in the right frame of mind, I won't pay attention to the person reading. If it's in a big group, I probably wouldn't pay attention. If it was, just my husband reading, then yeah, I'd probably listen. I mean, we have had evenings where we've been very tired and just sort of sat in bed, and he's read a couple of Bible excerpts to me. Now, I don't read the Bible, and I don't really go to church, but it's quite nice that he's taken the time to read them, and I do listen to them. But that might be because of the atmosphere, or whether it's just him reading to me and it's not an entire room of people. So I don't feel like I'm under pressure, sort of thing. But it's a very, very important thing to bring up. Does anybody else have any comments on it?
Yeah. We go off-grid camping. So where we go, there's no internet, no Wi-Fi. You can't even make a phone call from your mobile, So
Good.
We go completely off. Oh yeah, we love it. And yeah, and I read to hubby. And the last book I read him was called The Music Shop. It's set in the late 80s, so it won't appeal to you younger ladies. But it's a romance as well, which I'm not normally into. But yeah, no, I read that one. I'm trying to think of the art. Rachel Joyce. Joyce is her name. But yeah, for us older people who were around in the 80s, but she talks about music through the book, through the characters. So she'll go from Beethoven all the way to the Sex Pistols. And so it's every genre, and so it's very interesting. And I was just thinking about you, actually, Birdie, like the way you seem to like to read. You like to read about things in your life, like you talked about where you worked, the Spitfire, or whatever plane it was you went in. And the boat. I'm like, yeah, you'd like to know more about what you're actually doing, and your experiences, which is really interesting. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I feel like there's a mix of the two. As you say, it can kind of cross over. Some books can kind of cross over with a story and fact, which I do quite like, because it keeps me engaged. It's not just a book of fact. It's actually relating to things, which is how I've always learned. I'm a very practical learner. So if I can't relate a fact to something, or be able to actually physically either do it or see it, then I'm not going to pay attention. It's not going to go in. I'm not going to learn it. But then on the complete flip side of that, the fantasy books are the complete opposite. They are full escapism. They are different worlds and can be quite confusing for people first starting off reading them. So yeah, there's definitely a key divide there, but I do go through sort of spates of 1 minute I'll be reading fantasy, and then in a few months I'll go back to reading my sort of half fact, half fiction, sort of more relatable books. Buttercup, did you have anything to add on Turtle's point of reading aloud?
Well, it's definitely true that reading is a very solitary thing to do. There's the audiobook. I only got audiobooks, I think, when I was too busy to read, because you really need to set some time off, I think, to sit down and get in the kind of mind space that you need to focus on letters and words, and things need to be quiet. And you don't always have that. So I think it was about 2 years ago, I started to listen to audiobooks. So I listened to, I think, one or two on my way to work, and that was the only time I really had to kind of dedicate to hobbies or anything. So, yeah, pretty much. Otherwise, I think I had a more social life. So at that time, it was, something that made more sense. Having a story told to me was nice.
Yeah, I think there is that divide of being able to escape. Having somebody else read to you, you can sort of switch off, as it were. I've got a friend who I recommended some books to her, and the first thing she did was actually get the audiobooks, because she's got a nearly 1-year-old, so she doesn't really have time to be able to be holding a book, so she tends to play the audiobooks. But she's getting through them just as fast as I'm reading my book, so it's sometimes quite difficult to keep up. But I feel like there's a different kind of vibe, of use of a better word, when it comes to reading it yourself and either having somebody else read to you or having an audiobook. With the audiobooks, you tend to have different voices doing the characters, whereas if you're reading it in your head, then you're kind of making those voices up, or you've pictured what they look like. And I feel like sometimes I called my friend a psychopath because she switched between reading the book to listening to it. And I couldn't deal with that. I couldn't deal with it because she somehow managed to go from, well, this person looks like this in my head and he sounds like this in my head, to suddenly this is what he sounds like on the audiobook. And in my head, the two didn't match up, and it just ruined it for me. So I just went back to reading it myself. I couldn't deal with the audiobook. So I feel like if you're going to go down that path, it's either someone reads it to you, you listen to the audiobook, or you read it. You cannot cross over, because it will just confuse things. You can't cross over.
What about watching the movie and then reading the book? That sort of crossover.
No. Read the book first.
No.
Always read the book first.
Book first.
Book first. Come on.
Always. Although
no way.
I will have to admit, how many people watched Lord of the Rings before they read it?
That would be me.
There we go. Yeah, I was the same. I have to admit, I did end up watching. That's one of a few that I had to sit down and watch before. I still haven't read them.
No, I read it.
I read the book first. I read The Hobbit.
I feel like it's a person's right. If you read, you have to read Lord of the Rings. There is no way out of it. You have to read it. And I mean, the only reason I haven't read it is because I don't have the books, and I don't have the money for the books because they are rather expensive. So I'm going to keep looking for secondhand ones and hope I can get the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I'm convinced my dad had the Lord of the Rings somewhere, but he's not. I'm convinced he's got it somewhere in the house. So if I find it, it might have to disappear off the bookshelf. On that note, Do you ladies have anything else to add before we wrap up this evening's stream or today's stream?
Nothing from me.
I have one
I'm
thing.
fine.
No more TikTok. Read a book.
Perfect.
I don't have time to read a book. I've got a chicken that I think she's egg bound. She's not looking too
Oh,
good
dear.
at the moment, so I'm going to be giving a chicken a bath today.
I was going to say, is it going to be the warm bath again? Yeah. We have had discussions of chickens on Wamen before, so it's definitely not a not a topic that we haven't had here before. Well, thank you very much, ladies, for joining me this evening. Very good chat on books. If anyone either listening or on panel has any topics that they want to suggest, then just ping them over to me or put them in the chat, and we'll go through them. When the next Wamen Hour will be depends on whoever's free. We're all very, very busy women. Make sure you read a book, and if anybody wants to join Wamen Hour, then pop me a message. We're always happy for more women, because the more we have, the easier it is to do streams, because more people are available. It's as simple as that. The more we have, the easier it is to be available. Thank you very much, ladies, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Birdie. Bye, beautiful.
Bye.